In the course of writing extensively about the video game series Dragon Age, analyzing its different characters, its setting, its structure, both digital and written, its novel tie-ins, and much of the discourse around its new releases, I've come across so many fascinating quirks and parallels that most days it really feels like I have another idea to write yet another essay about yet another weird or interesting thing in Dragon Age. This is an essay about the third game, Dragon Age Inquisition, and more specifically it is an essay about the romance options available to the player. Even more specifically still, this is an essay about Sera. The character of Sera is one among several unique companions available to the player, combinable in groups of at most 3 at a time, and who hang out in the hub area of the game. Dragon Age is a cutscene-heavy game. A huge amount of it involves the player walking around or fighting or navigating menus, but significantly every time something extremely important to the story happens, the game generates a cutscene using the player's current custom character and whichever other characters happen to be in the scene. Cutscenes in video games are weird. We don't often talk about how weird cutscenes in video games are, but they are. For example, imagine any other artistic medium immediately asking you to engage with a different medium at intervals. Imagine reading a book and being asked to solve a puzzle to get to the next page, or maybe you can skip it but you're missing key information. Imagine watching a movie and being asked to answer a riddle to decide which scene you should watch next. I could go on, but you get the idea. These are things that functionally exist, but they're unusual in a way that cutscenes in video games are not. A more aptly mundane comparison might be audience participation in a theater show or a choose-your-own-adventure novel. In fact, video games have another example of this, a fact with which you may be entirely familiar if you've ever caught yourself reading a book that you found in a digital environment. The thing about carrying over a sliver of another medium into a new medium is that you're effectively porting the norms of the existing medium into new media. This is, generally speaking, a very good thing because it means you can lean on established ideas your audience will have about how to engage. If you do it well, they might not even realize they're having those ideas at all. So it is with film and video games. In Dragon Age, we have an example of a video game which is pervasively filmic. The player is introduced to Inquisition with a cutscene, a character creator, another cutscene, a cutscene gamified by a dialogue tree, another cutscene, gameplay progressively interspersed with more cutscenes, and then finally a more open-ended experience that inevitably returns to more cutscenes here and there for effect, especially to emphasize emotional moments or transition between scenes. Using the norms of film to define the bounds of a scene in a temporal context is relatively straightforward. This is at least as old and as typified by games like the Don Bluth classics Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, games which are enticing and memorable specifically because of their animated sequences. Their sequencing between player actions gamifies them as surely as the dialogue trees in Dragon Age do for that game's cutscenes. Cutscenes, and therefore the norms of cinema, become a part of the video game. But these norms don't merely exist in how gameplay is sequenced. They do not merely operate as transitions. The way shots are framed, for example, uses the fundamentals of film to present elements from the game in a specific light, that wording being intentional on my part. I say Dragon Age is pervasively filmic because the cutscenes can be gamified, but the digiludic environments, those digital spaces and areas in which the gameplay will be taking place, appear not just in gamified cutscenes, but in more standard ones too. If you think about cutscenes as little films that happen in between gameplay moments, then the idea that gameplay could invade those films in the same way that the films invade the game is kind of fascinating. More subtle is the manner in which you can be playing through an area, see that area in a cutscene, maybe with an effect of something you did lingering for the duration of a conversation with an NPC, and then return to that same digital space. This awareness, communicated through active spells or blood splatters as you, the Inquisitor, are setting up little movies to happen in the same environment where all gameplay happens, causes the cutscenes to lose their sense of temporal in-betweenness in many cases. You see, a video game is like a movie that you play. Subscribe to my Patreon for this and other annoying observations. All of that is to say that the way narrative art or narratives in art represent sights or points of view are built on a cultural memory, a deeply significant history, and so the traditions of the arts inform each other even as they build upon one another. In the case of Dragon Age, the character of Sera is an elf, already a racialized other in the world of Thedas, but this is in many ways the least interesting thing about her. She certainly seems to think so, despite the fact that female elf is probably the most frequent introductory assessment of what and who Sera is. Much of Sera's dialogue downplays her elvishness, or even the significance of elvish culture and racial oppression in general. Players will take to the internet to note that when they roleplay as an elf, she can grate on them, just like she canonically grates on characters like Solus, who himself represents an ancient history of elvish oppression, whose exact character is largely forgotten to the world at large. Sera represents the New World, the elves after they lost so much of their culture repeatedly. Ironically, despite her indifference, Sera's attitude is not entirely out of step with a more aware and justified anger that an elf who was invested in the preservation and even return of ancient elvish culture might have at the old elven gods or Evanuris now worshipped by many of the devout elves, keeping elven traditions alive. That's all canon material, more or less, but the player's choices create different story outcomes in the context of Dragon Age Inquisition. For example, the Inquisitor can snub Sera's initial offer of help, or otherwise offend and part ways with Sera later on. Alternatively, the Inquisitor might have different exchanges with Sera based on how the player feels about their exchanges or the world at large, or even just what attitude the player wishes to affect for the sake of roleplay or gameplay experimentation. A male Inquisitor, however, cannot romance Sera. He can romance Cassandra, Josephine, Ironbolt, Dorian, and Harding, but not Cullen, Blackwall, Solus, or Sera. Out of all the female romance options, Sera alone is exclusive to female players. And that makes her special. Her specialness is not exclusively a product of her exclusivity, although that she is restricted becomes naturally a part of why many players won't pursue a relationship with her on a particular run. This is something of a controversial game design decision. Dragon Age Origins had 2 heterosexual-only romance options and 2 bisexual romance options. Dragon Age 2 had 4 bisexual romance options. After that second game's release, I vaguely recall a certain atmosphere of uncertainty among queer Dragon Age fans. On the one hand, more options lends greater creativity to the player. There does exist a certain philosophy in game design called soft design, which pursues player comfort, so the fewest choices are made to disrupt, challenge, or otherwise reorient the player's choice around what the game designer wants the player to do. The alternative is spiky design, a name given to game design elements that call the player to conform to the developer's vision. You've probably heard a very silly person tell you at least once that violating a player's comfort is bad design, or that a game is bad because it doesn't challenge the player. The real truth, of course, is that both elements of game design give developers a creative opportunity and players a satisfying range of experience. If developers never designed around player comfort, there would be no soft design, and there would be no relaxation, no openness, no sense of freedom. If developers never designed to violate player comfort, there would be no spiky design, and there would be no tension, no direction, no sense of challenge. Choosing to take Dragon Age back to the days of gender-locked romance options was a design choice that leaned spikier. It attached consequences to decisions made when designing a custom character, which inherently presented players with restrictions. These restrictions aren't like having a limited number of hairstyles or outfits to wear. Those are what you might call fixed limits, whereas a more dialogical limit is a limit imposed by the developers, but only as a consequence of a player's own choice. To be clear, these terms aren't ones I've inherited from game designers like the other ones I mentioned earlier regarding soft and spiky design. This second pair of terms are an invention for the sake of this essay. A fixed limit is a set of unchanging options. If you pick a male character or a female character in Dark Souls, you get the same hair options. A dialogical limit feels more like a back and forth with the designers, a sort of, well, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to do this. Like how the voice options for the Inquisitor consist of 4 different voices, but 2 are only available to male characters and 2 are only available to female characters. For a more literal example, consider that investing points in different perks, completing different quests, or having a different background will give the Inquisitor new choices in dialogue trees. Hopefully, it's clear where I'm going with this. The Inquisitor has a different relationship with Sera based on whether they're a woman or a man, and only if they're a woman can they successfully pursue a relationship with her in a romantic context. This feature makes Inquisition unique among Dragon Age games, as only in Inquisition will a character be unromanceable in the context of a straight relationship, but romanceable in the context of a gay relationship. Sera shares this feature with Dorian, and their heterosexually romanceable counterparts across the series include Morrigan, Alistair, Cassandra, Blackwall, Solus, and Cullen. Dorian needs to be the subject of his own essay, but this all puts Sera in a unique position. She, far from being a female character who functionally waits for a male player character to approach her, instead denies such advances and is available only to female characters. This fact allows the player to engage with her in a unique cultural context. As a point of reference, there's a part in John Berger's Ways of Seeing where he interviews a group of women for their perspectives in response to his analysis of the presentation of women in the tradition of nude depictions in European paintings. Two of them have a truly transcendental series of remarks on depictions of women and sexual availability, which I think are worth discussing.
I've only just recently read that book, Histoire d'eau, which describes the way in which a woman is reduced for the sexual pleasure of the man she's in love with to a complete object. And what struck me in all that book as the most impressive image was the fact that she was told that she was never to touch her own breasts, to entirely close her mouth, or to put her legs together. And so the whole point about her stance all the time was that she was available. And the sense of being available, the sense of waiting for other people, is the very antithesis of action. And just like the Brook Street Bureau advertisement, Tony hasn't rung, he's 3 minutes late and ringing. And you feel this whole situation, the number of women you talk to who say, I stay in so many nights a week waiting for somebody to ring. That the concept of availability implies passivity, because if you're simply waiting for somebody else to act, then you can't act yourself.
Yes, it's like you will awake when a man taps you, when a man kisses you, you will arise and get off your bed. But really it's an excuse to get yourself going. I think women are too shy. They're waiting too long.
Yes.
I love these observations because they take one element of the arts and enable us to apply an analysis of that to another medium. I had a professor when I was at my university who instilled a deep and abiding respect for new media in me, and that potential really speaks to me. One such parallel might be the way in which romance literature or erotica can posit fantasies that remove a woman's need to deny or erase her own desires with a kind of plausible deniability, something covered quite well in the ContraPoints video about the Twilight series, which I commend to all of you. Here we also see the norms of another art form becoming relevant to video games, as the norms of film do with the implementation of the cutscene. The relevance of these observations to lesbian relationships is, regardless of intent, fairly obvious. Queer women observing these facts may recall the useless lesbian trope, which is less of a trope exclusively and more of a real social phenomenon also occasionally expressed through storytelling. Women who date women know that women are really like that sometimes. You can really get two girls who would love nothing more than to hold hands in a room together, and despite being physically within reach of one another and culturally and temporally in direct contact, they may nevertheless never meet for lack of initiative. By contrast, lesbians who are direct and forward, especially butch lesbians, may fall prey to dated stereotypes and socially conservative moral fearmongering. Frequently, we diagnose this phenomenon in the context of male absence, which is to say that this is how women behave relative to men, and so this is how they behave with each other. However, if we are considering strictly women who only date other women, this does not entirely explain the behavior, nor does it appear to fully describe their mental state with reference to their actual wants and desires. This, to me, requires another radical component to fit together the whole puzzle. In the text Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the Brazilian academic Paulo Freire remarks that, quote, "The oppressed suffer from the duality which has established itself in their innermost being. They discover that without freedom they cannot exist authentically, yet although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They are at one and the same time themselves in the oppressor whose consciousness they have internalized. The conflict lies in the choice between being wholly themselves or being divided, between ejecting the oppressor within or not ejecting them, between human solidarity and alienation, between following prescriptions of having choices, between being spectators or actors, between acting or having the illusion of acting through the action of the oppressors, between speaking out or being silent, castrated in their power to create and recreate, in their power to transform the world. This is the tragic dilemma of the oppressed which their education must take into account." The terms oppressor and oppressed here are used with relevance to post-colonial discourse of the 20th century. In an early 21st century context, a more intelligible set of terms might be privileged and marginalized. These terms, too, are imperfect, denoting a similar experience within a group whose place in society has in many ways been dictated to them. I don't use this language because I believe human beings are reducible to these labels, or because I believe their connotations are perfectly fitting to every situation, but because oppression and marginalization are, at a basic level, real things in need of acknowledgement. If we can be allowed to use imperfect language to acknowledge the way in which society is organized, we might find ourselves capable of remarking on a few things. For example, useless lesbianism is basically patriarchal oppressor consciousness occupying the minds of women who love women, and as such is a symptom of their struggle to be free of a concept of themselves that is not entirely their own. It is a lesbian struggle to be a woman who exists without reference to a man. In Dragon Age Inquisition, Sera could not be less interested in how men see her. Actually, in terms of her backstory, which she shares with the Inquisitor in a touching scene, her prior concern with how a man she knew felt about elves was a touchy subject, as she feels it was used to manipulate her in an unnecessary manner. Sera is quite conscious of how her concern for how she is seen by others could be used against her. Despite this, she still allows herself to care about powerless people who are afflicted with injustices in the world of Thedas, which is a funny thing, since people with her politics are often painted alternatively as performative virtue signalers who only care about the impressions they make on others, or as insecure overcompensators who are secretly the real bigots. Sera is a frustrating companion because she's so damn morally consistent, too much in some ways, almost more than she should be. For example, when I tried romancing her in a recent playthrough to get footage for this essay, I got invested in trying to improve her approval of my Inquisitor. As a result, I intentionally made decisions to raise her approval level, and, as a result of that, was surprised more than once by her views. As an example, Sera loathes magic. She hates everything behind the veil. She also doesn't give the Dalish any special regard. What's fascinating about that is how, at a surface level, one would assume the opposite, since by a certain logic, mages are oppressed and the Dalish have been profoundly disenfranchised by human empires. However, Sera's hate for magic conforms weirdly to the truth about the oppression of the ancient elves by the Evanuris, as well as subsequent oppression by Tevinter. So while it's not my perspective, I can see how she came to that view, and having her explain it makes a lot of sense. And that's really the whole story, isn't it? Dragon Age relishes an opportunity here and there to force the player to conform to its world, and not the other way around. Sera's romance and approval are spiky design in a certain sense, but they're conducive to humanizing a lesbian character, especially in the context of her lesbianism, but also in the context of her political and social views, and her racial status. I suppose humanizing is a funny word to use in that context, but it's quite accurate to real-world ideas about oppression, and therefore also intelligible as both metaphor and characterization. That spiky design then becomes an invitation for the player to get creative with a new save file, a new Inquisitor, and new decisions that affect the world of Thedas. It presents the player the opportunity to develop the lore of their Dragon Age setting, which then becomes the soft design that caters to player freedom. These two design elements are in dialogue with each other and the player. This design choice also creates an opportunity with how Sera is written. Gay women and players in general who may choose to affect the role of a gay woman in a role-playing context may see themselves humanized by Sera's writing. The dialogue and design of Sera as a character presents her as being capable of asserting boundaries that in turn make her more real, and that realness presents in the conflict and compassion between her and the player character. A lot has been said since the release of Dragon Age 2 and onward into the more recent years of the series about the presentation of romanceable characters as ambiguously bisexual or pansexual. In this form, a queer character may be alternatively straightforwardly queer or indistinctly neutral, because the identities of socially privileged groups are taken so commonly as a social default, and queer identities are, outside coding, often invisible prior to dialogue and behavior. The alternative, present in characters like Sera and Dorian, not only grants some semblance of narrative agency to these characters and therefore humanizes them, it also by contrast humanizes characters who are then written to be bisexual or pansexual by making those qualities of the identity concrete and definite characteristics as opposed to vague potentialities that remain indeterminate until the player decides whether said NPC is going to be in a queer relationship this time. In this way, Sera achieves a simulation of her own consciousness that might otherwise be less present in her design. She is not an eternally available object awaiting the potential for male consumption. Similarly, she is not, as a gay woman, occupied by the consciousness of her male or heterosexual counterparts in the way she might be if so much of her identity could be dictated to her. This all creates for Sera a potential to be received as genuine, but it does one other amazing thing for her as a character. Specifically, she as a character facilitates something special for players who may choose to opt into the role of playing a queer female inquisitor. The sincerity and humanizing quality of her character and the fact she is accessible specifically to female characters gives those female characters an opportunity to be more fully themselves. By extension, this is also true of gay women who play the game, because not only is their reflection humanized, the reinforcement of the ability of gay women to deny the advances of men also creates the plausible deniability that thwarts the paralysis of women needing to operate as an available object. Sera waits for you. She is an open invitation for you specifically should you choose her. Her existence is a reassurance. It is okay to be a queer woman, your desires are not wrong, and you can initiate with the press of a button. You are allowed to be yourself. This is safety. This is validation.